The rain came down like bullets against the wooden door, and Zane Lawson barely heard the knock over the thunder that shook the Montana plains. He stood from his chair by the dying fire, his hand instinctively moving to the revolver at his hip before he caught himself. 6 years living alone had made him cautious, but not cruel. When he opened the door, the woman standing there was drenched through her black morning dress, shivering so hard her teeth chattered, and he stepped aside without saying a word. She stumbled in, trailing water across the floorboards he had scrubbed just that morning. Her dark hair hung in soaked ropes down her back, and her hands clutched a small leather bag against her chest, like it contained the last precious thing in the world. Zane closed the door against the howling wind and turned to face her properly. She was young, maybe 23 or 24, with a pale face and eyes the color of creek water after the snow melts. "Thank you," she managed to say through chattering teeth. "I did not know where else to go." Zane gestured to the chair he had vacated. "Sit. I will get you something dry." He moved to the trunk at the foot of his bed and pulled out one of his old shirts and a blanket. When he turned back, she had not moved, still standing in that same spot, creating a puddle on his floor. "The bedroom is through there," he said, nodding toward the curtained doorway. "Change out of those wet clothes before you catch your death." She looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether she could trust him, then nodded and took the dry clothes from his outstretched hand. Her fingers brushed his, ice cold, and he fought the urge to close his own hand around them to warm them. She disappeared behind the curtain, and he busied himself building up the fire and putting on a pot of coffee. By the time she emerged, wearing his shirt that hung to her knees and wrapped in the blanket, the cabin had warmed considerably. Her hair was still damp, but she had wrung it out, and some color had returned to her cheeks. She sat in the chair without being asked again, and accepted the tin cup of coffee he handed her with a murmured thanks. "My name is Ophelia James," she said after she had taken several sips. "I was staying at the boarding house in Fort Stockton, but when the storm hit, I was out walking and got turned around. I saw your light through the trees." "Zane Lawson," he replied, settling into the other chair. He had built it himself last winter when the loneliness had gotten too heavy and he needed something to occupy his hands. "Fort Stockton is 5 miles south. You walked a long way in the wrong direction." She looked down into her coffee. "I suppose I did." There was more to that story, Zane could tell, but he was not the kind of man to pry. The storm raged outside, and he knew she would not be going anywhere until morning at the earliest. He had a spare bedroll he could lay out for himself near the fire. "You said your name was James?" he asked, more to fill the silence than anything else. "Yes, I was married to Thomas James. He died 3 months ago." Her voice remained steady, but her knuckles went white around the coffee cup. "We had a ranch about 30 miles east of here. When he died, his brother claimed it was rightfully his, since Thomas and I had no children. The law agreed with him." Zane felt a familiar anger kindle in his chest. He had seen this story play out too many times in the 7 years he had been in Montana territory. A woman left with nothing because the law did not see her as worthy of owning property in her own right. "I am sorry," he said, and meant it. She looked up at him then, really looked at him, and he felt something shift in the air between them. "You are kind to take me in." Most men would not open their door to a strange woman in the night. "Most men are fools," Zane said simply. A small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth, the first he had seen from her. It transformed her face, made her beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with the arrangement of her features and everything to do with the life that sparked in her eyes. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the storm. Eventually, Ophelia's eyes began to droop, and Zane rose to pull out his bedroll. He laid it near the fire and gestured for her to take the bed. "I cannot take your bed," she protested. "You can and you will," he said firmly. "I have slept on worse than a floor." She looked like she wanted to argue but was too exhausted. She disappeared behind the curtain again, and he heard the ropes of the bed frame creak as she lay down. He stretched out on the bedroll, using his saddle as a pillow, and closed his eyes. Sleep did not come easily. He kept thinking about the woman in his bed, about the wedding ring she still wore on her left hand, about the way her voice had sounded when she spoke of her dead husband. When morning came, the storm had blown itself out, leaving the world washed clean and bright. Zane woke to find Ophelia already up, standing by the window looking out at the mountains in the distance. She had put her black dress back on, and it hung stiffly on her frame, still damp in places. "I should go," she said when she noticed he was awake. "I have imposed on your hospitality long enough." "Where will you go?" Zane asked, sitting up and running a hand through his hair. She was quiet for a moment. "I do not know. I have a cousin in Virginia City, but I do not have enough money for the stage. I was hoping to find work in Fort Stockton, but nobody wants to hire a widow with no skills." Zane stood and walked to the stove, stirring up the coals to heat water for coffee and breakfast. "What kind of skills do you have?" "I can cook and clean and sew. I can read and write and do figures. On the ranch, I helped with the animals and the garden." She said it almost defensively, as if she had been told many times that these things did not count as skills. "That is more than most people can claim," Zane said. He pulled out the pan and started slicing bacon. "I could use some help around here, if you are willing to work. I have been meaning to expand the garden, and the fence on the north pasture needs mending. The pay would not be much, but you would have a place to stay and food to eat until you saved enough for that stage ticket." He kept his back to her as he said it, not wanting her to feel pressured by his gaze. The offer had come out before he had fully thought it through, but now that it was out there, he realized it made perfect sense. He did need help, and she needed work. It was a practical arrangement, nothing more. "Why would you do that for me?" Ophelia asked quietly. Zane flipped the bacon in the pan. "Because everyone deserves a chance to get back on their feet. Because I know what it is like to have nowhere to go. Because it is the right thing to do." He paused. "And because I actually do need the help. This place is too much for one person to manage alone." He heard her move behind him, sensed her coming closer. When he turned, she was standing just a few feet away, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I accept," she said, "and I promise I will work hard. You will not regret this." "I know I will not," Zane said, and handed her a plate. They ate breakfast in companionable silence, and then Zane showed her around the property. He had 40 acres of decent grazing land, a barn that needed repairs, a chicken coop, and a good well. The garden plot was overgrown with weeds, and the fence he had mentioned really did need work. It was honest work, the kind that would keep them both busy from sunup to sundown. Ophelia surveyed it all with a critical eye. "Where did you learn to ranch?" "I did not," Zane admitted. "I was a soldier before this, fought in the war, then drifted west like a lot of other men with nothing to go home to. I won this land in a card game about 6 years ago and figured I might as well try to make something of it." "You were a Union soldier," she guessed. "Yes. You?" "My father fought for the Union. He died at Gettysburg." Her voice was matter-of-fact, but he heard the old pain beneath it. "Thomas never fought. He had a bad leg from a childhood accident. Some people gave him trouble about it, said he was a coward, but he was the bravest man I ever knew." Zane heard the love in her voice and felt a strange pang in his chest. He had never had anyone speak of him that way, had never loved anyone enough to speak of them that way. The war had taken that possibility from him, or so he had thought. They spent the day working side by side. Ophelia proved to be as capable as she had claimed, tackling the overgrown garden with determination. Zane worked on the fence, but found his eyes drifting to her more often than they should. She had tied her hair back with a strip of cloth and pushed up the sleeves of her dress, and there was something appealing about the way she moved, efficient and strong. That night, they ate the stew she had made from the vegetables in his root cellar and the rest of the bacon. It was better than anything Zane had cooked for himself in months, maybe years. "This is good," he said, and she smiled. "My mother taught me. She said a good meal could solve most of life's problems, or at least make them easier to bear." "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." She was. "She died when I was 16. Fever took her." Ophelia pushed the food around on her plate. "Sometimes I feel like I have lost everyone I ever loved." Zane did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing. But when she looked up at him, he made sure she could see the sympathy in his eyes. The days fell into a rhythm after that. They worked hard during the daylight hours, and in the evenings they would sit by the fire and talk. Zane learned that Ophelia had grown up in Missouri, that she loved to read but had not owned a book since she was a girl, that she had always wanted to see the ocean. She learned that he had a sister back in Ohio he had not seen in 10 years, that he was 28 years old, that he had nightmares sometimes about the war, but they were getting less frequent. 3 weeks after Ophelia arrived, Zane rode into Fort Stockton for supplies. The general store was run by a man named Horace Webb, who was friendly enough but loved to gossip. "Heard you got yourself a housekeeper," Horace said as he wrapped up Zane's order of flour and sugar. "News travels fast," Zane replied evenly. "You know how it is. Not much happens around here, so people talk about what does happen." Horace leaned across the counter conspiratorially. "That is the James widow, is it not? Heard her brother-in-law turned her out without a penny. Shame that. She always seemed like a decent woman." "She is a decent woman," Zane said firmly, "and a hard worker. I am lucky to have her help." Horace held up his hands. No offense meant, just making conversation. But as Zane rode back to the ranch, he felt troubled. He knew what people would say, what they probably were already saying. A widow living alone with an unmarried man. It did not matter that they were both adults, that their arrangement was purely practical. People would talk, and that talk could harm Ophelia's reputation even more than it already had been. When he got back, he found her in the garden, her hands dark with soil. She looked up when she heard his horse, and her face lit up with a smile that made his heart do something strange in his chest. "Did you get everything we needed?" she called. "Yes, and I got you something." He dismounted and pulled a small package from his saddlebag. Horace mentioned he had just gotten these in. Ophelia wiped her hands on her apron and took the package, unwrapping it carefully. Inside were 3 books, their covers slightly worn but still in good condition. She looked up at him with such joy in her eyes that he had to look away. "Zane, you should not have. These must have cost a fortune." "Not a fortune. And you said you liked to read." He busied himself with unsaddling his horse. "Everyone should have something that brings them happiness." That night, after supper, Ophelia read aloud from one of the books while Zane repaired a broken bridle. Her voice was soft and melodious, and he found himself getting lost in the sound of it more than the actual words of the story. When she finally closed the book and looked up, she caught him staring at her. "What is it?" she asked. "Nothing," he said quickly. "I was just thinking." About what? He should have lied, should have made something up, but the words came out before he could stop them. "About how glad I am that you knocked on my door that night." Ophelia's expression softened. "I am glad too. I do not know what would have happened to me if you had not taken me in. You would have survived. You are stronger than you think. Maybe, but I am grateful I did not have to find out. She stood and moved closer to where he sat. You have been so kind to me, Zane. I do not know how I will ever repay you. You do not need to repay me. Your help around here is more than enough. But even as he said it, he knew it was not just about the help. Over the past weeks, his cabin had become a home in a way it never had been before. The sound of her humming while she cooked, the sight of her boots next to his by the door, the way she laughed at his terrible jokes, all of it had woven itself into the fabric of his daily life until he could not imagine it any other way. He was falling in love with her. The realization hit him like a physical blow, and he nearly dropped the bridle he was holding. "Are you all right?" Ophelia asked, concerned. "Fine, just tired." He set the bridle aside and stood. "I think I will turn in early tonight." He could feel her watching him as he laid out his bedroll, could sense her confusion at his abrupt change in mood. But he could not explain, not when he barely understood it himself. She was a widow, still mourning her husband. She wore her wedding ring every day, a constant reminder that her heart belonged to a dead man. And even if that were not the case, what did he have to offer her? A run-down ranch and a man haunted by his past, but knowing he should not love her did not make it any less true. Summer deepened into August, and the work on the ranch intensified. They brought in the hay and repaired the barn roof before the fall rains came. Ophelia's garden flourished under her care, providing them with fresh vegetables every day. She canned what they could not eat, lining the shelves in the root cellar with jars of tomatoes and beans and pickles. They had settled into an easy partnership, anticipating each other's needs without having to speak. Zane knew that Ophelia liked her coffee black in the morning, but with cream in the evening. Ophelia knew that Zane got restless when he stayed in one place too long, and would sometimes disappear for hours to ride the perimeter of the property. But there was a tension growing between them too, something neither of them acknowledged but both of them felt. It was in the way their hands would brush when passing each other something, in the way Zane's eyes would follow her when she moved around the cabin, in the way Ophelia would sometimes touch his arm when she spoke to him, her fingers lingering just a moment too long. One evening in late August, they were sitting outside watching the sun set behind the mountains. The air was cooling down from the heat of the day, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "I have saved almost enough money for that stage ticket," Ophelia said suddenly. Zane felt his stomach drop. "That is good. I am sure your cousin will be happy to see you." "Yes, I suppose so. I have not seen her in 5 years. We used to be close when we were girls." She was quiet for a moment. "But I have been thinking, maybe I do not want to go to Virginia City after all." "No." His voice sounded strange even to his own ears, tight with hope he was trying to suppress. "No. I thought I wanted to leave Montana to start fresh somewhere where nobody knew me as Thomas's widow. But I realize now that I am not running towards something in Virginia City. I am just running away from my grief, and I can do that anywhere." She turned to look at him, and in the fading light her eyes were luminous. "And I have been happy here, happier than I have been in a long time." "You can stay as long as you want," Zane said carefully. "You know that." "Do you want me to stay?" It was a simple question, but the weight of it hung in the air between them. Zane could give her the safe answer, could keep things as they were, or he could tell her the truth. "Yes," he said, "I want you to stay. I want you to stay more than I have wanted anything in a very long time." Ophelia drew in a sharp breath. "Zane, I know I should not say this. I know you are still mourning Thomas, and I respect that, but I cannot keep pretending that I do not feel what I feel." He turned to face her fully. "I love you, Ophelia. I think I have loved you since that first night when you stood dripping on my floor, and if you decide to go to Virginia City, I will understand. But I had to tell you. I had to let you know that you have a home here, not just as my employee, but as whatever you want to be." For a long moment, she did not say anything. Then she reached up and slowly pulled the wedding ring from her finger. She held it in her palm, looking down at it. "I love Thomas," she said quietly. "I will always love him in a way. He was good to me and we built a life together. But he has been gone for nearly 5 months now, and I am still here. I am still alive, and I still have a life to live." She looked up at Zane. "I have felt guilty for weeks now because I realized I was falling in love with you. It felt like a betrayal of Thomas's memory. But then I thought, would Thomas want me to be alone for the rest of my life? Would he want me to deny myself happiness out of some misguided sense of loyalty to the past?" "And what did you decide?" Zane asked, his heart pounding so hard he was sure she could hear it. "I decided that Thomas loved me enough to want me to be happy. And you make me happy, Zane. You make me feel alive again." She reached out and took his hand. "I love you too. I want to stay, not as your employee, but as your wife, if you will have me." Zane felt like he could not breathe. "If I will have you, Ophelia, there is nothing I want more in this world." He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, but she did not pull away. Instead, she closed the distance between them, and when their lips met, it felt like coming home. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, but then it deepened, and Zane pulled her closer, his hand cupping the back of her head. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. Ophelia rested her forehead against his. "I have not kissed anyone but Thomas since I was 17 years old," she said. "I have not kissed anyone in over 3 years," Zane admitted. "I think we are both out of practice." She laughed, and the sound was like music. "Then we will just have to practice more." They sat there under the stars, holding each other, and talked until the moon rose high in the sky. They talked about their future, about expanding the ranch, about the life they would build together. Ophelia suggested they could get married in Fort Stockton as soon as the arrangements could be made. Zane agreed, though he would have married her right then and there if it were possible. When they finally went inside, Zane started to lay out his bedroll as he had every night since Ophelia arrived. But she caught his hand. "You do not have to sleep on the floor anymore," she said softly. "Ophelia, we are not married yet. I do not want to compromise your honor." She smiled at him, and there was love in her eyes but also a hint of amusement. "My honor has already been compromised by living here with you for 2 months. Anyone who wants to talk about that is already talking. Besides, I am not suggesting anything improper. I am just saying that the bed is big enough for 2 people, and you have given up your comfort for long enough. We can wait until we are married for everything else." Zane hesitated, but the thought of sleeping next to her, of being able to hold her through the night, was too tempting. He nodded, and they lay down together on the bed, fully clothed. Ophelia curled into his side, her head on his chest, and he wrapped his arms around her. "This is nice," she murmured, already half asleep. "Yes," Zane agreed. "This is nice." He lay awake long after she had drifted off, listening to her steady breathing, feeling the weight of her against him. He had been alone for so long, had convinced himself that he was better off that way. But now he understood that he had not been living, just existing. Ophelia had brought him back to life. The next morning, they rode into Fort Stockton together. Zane wanted to speak to the circuit preacher about performing the ceremony, and Ophelia needed fabric to make a new dress. She refused to be married in her mourning clothes, she said. The preacher, a thin man named Reverend Samuel Cooper, was staying at the boarding house. He listened to their request and nodded thoughtfully. "I can perform the ceremony next Sunday," he said. "That will give you time to make the proper arrangements. Do you have witnesses?" Zane realized they did not know anyone well enough to ask. But before he could say anything, A voice spoke up from across the room. "I will stand as a witness." They turned to see a woman in her 40s rising from her seat by the window. She had kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical bun. "I am Martha Williams," she said. "I have been living in Fort Stockton for 10 years, and I remember you, Mrs. James. You and your husband bought supplies from my husband's store a few times. You were always polite and friendly. I am sorry for your loss." "Thank you," Ophelia said. "That is very kind of you to offer to stand as a witness." "It would be my pleasure, and I am sure my husband will agree to stand as the second witness. He is not much for sentiment, but he appreciates love when he sees it." Martha smiled at them. "You two look at each other the way my Henry and I did when we were young. That is worth celebrating." True to Martha's word, Henry Williams agreed to be the second witness. He was a gruff man with a weather-beaten face, but he shook Zane's hand firmly and told Ophelia she looked radiant, which made her blush. The week leading up to the wedding was a flurry of activity. Ophelia sewed her dress, a simple creation in pale blue that made her eyes shine. Zane cleaned the cabin from top to bottom, repaired everything that needed repairing, and even bought a new shirt for the occasion. He felt nervous in a way he had not felt since before the war, when his biggest worry had been asking a girl to dance at a barn raising. On Saturday night, Ophelia stayed at the boarding house in Fort Stockton, saying it was bad luck for the groom to see the bride before the wedding. Zane spent the night alone in the cabin and barely slept. He kept thinking about the next day, about the fact that by this time tomorrow, Ophelia would be his wife. It seemed too good to be true, like something that would be snatched away from him at the last moment. But Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, and when Zane rode into Fort Stockton, his fears melted away. The church was a simple wooden structure at the edge of town, and inside, Reverend Cooper was already prepared. Martha and Henry were there, along with a handful of other townsfolk who had heard about the wedding and wanted to watch. Then Ophelia walked in, and Zane forgot how to breathe. The blue dress fit her perfectly, and she had pinned her hair up with a few loose curls framing her face. She carried a small bouquet of wildflowers, and when she smiled at him, he knew he was the luckiest man alive. The ceremony was simple and short. They exchanged vows in strong, clear voices. Zane promised to love and cherish Ophelia for the rest of his days, to support her and protect her and be a true husband to her. Ophelia promised to love and honor Zane, to stand by his side through whatever challenges life brought them, to be a true wife to him. When Reverend Cooper pronounced them husband and wife and told Zane he could kiss his bride, the kiss was sweet and full of promise. The small congregation clapped and cheered, and Martha wiped tears from her eyes. Afterward, the Williams insisted on hosting a small celebration at their home. They served cake and lemonade, and Henry brought out his fiddle and played a few songs. Zane danced with Ophelia in the Williams parlor, holding her close and thinking that this was what happiness felt like. As the sun began to set, they said their goodbyes and rode back to the ranch together. Zane had tied tin cans to the back of the wagon as a joke, and they rattled all the way home. Ophelia laughed and said it was the perfect end to a perfect day. When they reached the cabin, Zane dismounted and then helped Ophelia down. She was his wife now. The thought still seemed unreal. He picked her up and carried her over the threshold, and she shrieked with laughter and held onto his neck. He set her down gently inside, and suddenly the air between them changed, grew heavy with anticipation. They were married now. They were husband and wife. Everything was different. "Are you nervous?" Zane asked softly. "A little," Ophelia admitted, "but I trust you." "I will be gentle," he promised. "We can go as slow as you need." She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "I know. That is why I am not more nervous than I am." That night, they came together as husband and wife, and it was tender and sweet, and everything Zane had hoped it would be. Afterward, they lay tangled in each other's arms, and Ophelia rested her head on his chest. "I love you," she whispered. "I am so glad I knocked on your door during that storm." "So am I," Zane said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "So am I." The next months were the happiest of Zane's life. He and Ophelia fell into a new rhythm, this one more intimate and complete than before. They worked the ranch together during the day, and at night they would lie in bed and talk about their dreams for the future. Ophelia wanted to get chickens and maybe a milk cow. Zane thought they should try to get a few more head of cattle before winter. As fall turned to winter, they prepared the ranch for the cold months ahead. They stocked the root cellar with Ophelia's preserves, chopped enough wood to last until spring, and made sure all the buildings were secure. On the first really cold night, they lay in bed listening to the wind howl outside, grateful for the warmth of the fire and each other. "You ever think about children?" Ophelia asked one night in December. Zane felt his heart skip a beat. "Sometimes, do you?" "Yes. I always wanted children, but Thomas and I were never blessed with any. The doctor told me there was no reason I could not conceive, so maybe it was just not meant to be." She was quiet for a moment. "But I would like to try if you want to." "I would like that very much," Zane said, pulling her closer. "I think you would be an amazing mother, and I think you would be an amazing father." They made love that night with a new intention, and in the months that followed, they continued to hope. Spring came, and with it new life on the ranch. The garden began to bloom, the cattle grew fat on the fresh grass, and Ophelia started to feel ill in the mornings. At first, she thought she had eaten something that did not agree with her. But when the illness continued for a week, then, too, a different possibility occurred to her. She waited another week to be sure, and then one evening she told Zane. "I think I am with child," she said, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. Zane felt a rush of joy so intense it nearly knocked him over. "Are you sure?" "As sure as I can be without seeing a doctor. All the signs are there. The morning sickness, the exhaustion, the tenderness." She smiled up at him. "We are going to have a baby, Zane." He pulled her into his arms and held her tight, his face buried in her hair. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for giving me this gift." "We are giving it to each other," she said. They rode into Fort Stockton the next week to see the doctor, who confirmed what Ophelia already knew. She was about 2 months along, which meant the baby would come in late November or early December. The doctor, an elderly man named Dr. Harrison, gave them advice on how to ensure a healthy pregnancy and told them to come back in a month. As Ophelia's belly began to grow, Zane found himself overwhelmed with protectiveness. He did not want her lifting anything heavy, did not want her working too hard in the garden. Ophelia laughed at his concern but also found it touching. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time," she reminded him. "I am not going to break, I know, but you are precious to me and so is our child. I just want to keep you both safe." She kissed him then, standing on her toes to reach his lips. "We are safe. We have you." The summer passed in a haze of heat and anticipation. Ophelia sewed tiny clothes and blankets, and Zane built a cradle from smooth pine wood. They argued good-naturedly about names. Ophelia liked Oliver for a boy and Olivia for a girl. Zane thought those were too similar to her own name and suggested Zachary for a boy and Zara for a girl. In the end, they decided to wait until the baby was born to choose. As fall arrived and Ophelia grew larger, Zane found himself both excited and terrified. He had seen men die in the war, had faced down outlaws and wild animals without flinching, but the thought of something happening to Ophelia during childbirth filled him with a dread, unlike anything he had ever known. "Women die in childbirth all the time," he said to Martha Williams one day when he had ridden into town for supplies. Ophelia had stayed home, too uncomfortable to make the journey. Martha patted his hand sympathetically. "They do. But most women survive just fine, especially healthy young women like your Ophelia. Dr. Harrison is a good doctor. He has delivered more babies than I can count. You have to have faith." "I am trying," Zane admitted, "but I do not know what I would do if I lost her." "You would survive because that is what we do, but you are not going to lose her. She is strong, your wife. I can see it in her." Zane held onto those words in the weeks that followed. Ophelia seemed serene, unbothered by his anxiety. She spent her days preparing the cabin for the baby's arrival, washing and rewashing the tiny clothes, arranging and rearranging the cradle. On a cold night in late November, Ophelia woke Zane in the early hours of the morning. "It is time," she said calmly. "The baby is coming." Zane shot out of bed, his heart racing. "I will ride for Dr. Harrison." "There is time," Ophelia said. "The pains just started. First babies usually take a while," but Zane was already pulling on his clothes and boots. "I am getting the doctor. I will be back as soon as I can." He rode through the darkness faster than was probably safe, pushing his horse hard. By the time he reached Fort Stockton and pounded on Dr. Harrison's door, he was wild-eyed and breathless. The doctor took one look at him and grabbed his bag. "First baby?" the doctor asked as they rode back. "Yes." "How did you know?" "You have that look. I see it all the time in expectant fathers. Try to calm down. Stress will not help your wife." When they arrived back at the cabin, Ophelia was still moving around, timing her pains. "Doctor." Harrison examined her and pronounced that everything was progressing normally. Martha Williams arrived shortly after, having been alerted by the doctor. She shooed Zane out of the bedroom. "This is women's work," she said firmly. "You will just be in the way. Go boil some water and pace if you need to, but stay out here." Zane did pace, back and forth across the cabin floor, wearing a path in the wood. He could hear Ophelia's voice through the curtain, could hear Martha encouraging her, could hear Dr. Harrison giving quiet instructions. The hours crawled by. Morning turned to afternoon, and still the baby had not come. Then, as the sun was beginning to set, Zane heard a new sound. The thin, reedy cry of a newborn baby. He froze, his heart in his throat, waiting. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few minutes, Martha pulled back the curtain. "You have a son," she said, beaming, "and your wife is doing just fine." Zane pushed past her into the bedroom. Ophelia was propped up against the pillows, looking exhausted but radiant. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in one of the blankets she had made. Dr. Harrison was cleaning his instruments, and everything smelled of blood and sweat and new life. "Come meet your son," Ophelia said softly. Zane approached slowly, as if in a dream. He looked down at the baby and felt his chest constrict. The infant had a red, wrinkled face and a dusting of dark hair. His eyes were closed, and one tiny fist was pressed against his mouth. "He is perfect," Zane whispered. "He is," Ophelia agreed. "Do you want to hold him?" Zane nodded, and Ophelia carefully transferred the baby into his arms. The weight was so light, and Zane was suddenly terrified he would drop him or hold him wrong. But the baby settled against his chest, and Zane felt something inside him shift and realign. This was his son. His and Ophelia's. A new life they had created together. "What should we name him?" Ophelia asked. Zane looked down at the baby, then up at his wife. "What about Owen? It starts with O like your name, and it is a strong name." "Owen Lawson," Ophelia said, trying it out. "I like it." "Owen James Lawson, after his father and after the man I was married to before. Both good men." Zane felt his throat tighten with emotion. That is perfect. Dr. Harrison and Martha left after making sure both mother and baby were healthy. Zane climbed into bed next to Ophelia, still holding Owen, and the three of them lay there together as night fell. "I cannot believe he is real," Zane said. "I cannot believe we made this perfect little person. I know. It feels like a miracle." Ophelia rested her head on his shoulder. "Thank you for giving me this family, Zane. A year ago I had nothing, and now I have everything. I am the one who should be thanking you. You gave me a reason to live again. You gave me hope." They sat in silence for a while, watching their son sleep. Finally, Ophelia took Owen and nursed him, and Zane watched in wonder. When the baby was fed and settled in his cradle, Zane and Ophelia finally slept, though they both woke several times through the night to check on him. The first months of Owen's life were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. He was a good baby, healthy and strong, but he still demanded constant attention. Zane found himself in awe of how naturally Ophelia took to motherhood, how she seemed to instinctively know what Owen needed. He did his best to help, changing diapers and walking the floor with his son when he was fussy, but he felt clumsy and inadequate next to his wife. "You are doing fine," Ophelia reassured him one night when he had apologized for the third time for not knowing how to calm the baby. "He loves you. Look at how he watches you when you hold him." It was true. Owen's eyes, which had started out dark blue but were now turning a lighter shade, did seem to track Zane's movements. And when Zane spoke to him in a low, soothing voice, the baby would quiet and listen. As winter deepened, they settled into their new life as a family. The work on the ranch continued, though Zane took on more of it to give Ophelia time to rest and care for Owen. When spring came and Owen was nearly 6 months old, Ophelia began to help out more, strapping the baby to her back in a sling while she worked in the garden. One warm day in May, they were all outside together. Zane was repairing a section of fence while Ophelia weeded the garden with Owen sleeping on a blanket nearby. Zane looked up from his work and saw his wife and son, saw the cabin and the land stretching out around them, and felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful. "What are you smiling about?" Ophelia called over to him. "Just thinking about how lucky I am," he called back. She smiled and returned to her weeding. But a few minutes later, she stood and walked over to him, Owen now awake and gurgling in her arms. "I have something to tell you," she said, and there was a particular light in her eyes that Zane had learned to recognize. "You are with child again," he guessed. She laughed. "How did you know I know you? I can read you like one of your books." He pulled her close, careful not to squish Owen between them. "How far along?" "Only a few weeks, I think. It is early yet, but I wanted you to know." Zane kissed her forehead. "Another baby, our family is growing. Are you happy?" "I am beyond happy. I am blessed." Their second child, a daughter they named Olive, was born the following January. The birth was easier than Owen's had been, and Dr. Harrison pronounced her perfectly healthy. She had Ophelia's coloring, with light brown hair and those same creek water eyes, and Zane fell in love with her immediately. Owen, now over a year old and toddling around on unsteady legs, was fascinated by his baby sister. He would stand by the cradle and watch her, occasionally reaching out a chubby hand to pat her head gently. Ophelia would supervise these interactions carefully, ready to intervene if Owen got too enthusiastic, but he was always gentle with Olive. The years passed in a blur of growth and change. Owen grew into a curious, active boy who followed his father everywhere and wanted to help with every task on the ranch. Olive was quieter, more thoughtful, but she had a stubborn streak that reminded Zane of his own mother. When she was 3, Ophelia gave birth to twins, boys they named Oscar and Otto. The cabin was bursting at the seams with 4 children under the age of 6, and Zane spent that summer building an addition to give them more space. By the time Owen was 10, he was genuinely helpful on the ranch, able to handle a horse and mend a fence as well as any adult. Olive was 7, and already reading better than most adults in Fort Stockton. The twins were 5 and inseparable, always getting into mischief together. Zane and Ophelia often collapsed into bed at night exhausted, but they would not have traded their chaotic, noisy household for anything. One evening in late summer, after the children were all finally asleep, Zane and Ophelia sat outside watching the stars, just as they had that night 12 years earlier when they had first confessed their love. "You ever regret it?" Ophelia asked. "Taking me in that night during the storm?" Zane turned to look at her, surprised. "Regret it? How could I possibly regret the best decision I ever made? I just mean, your life was so quiet before I came along. Now you have 4 children and a wife and constant chaos. Sometimes I worry that you miss the peace and solitude." Zane took her hand and brought it to his lips. "I was not at peace before you came, Ophelia. I was lonely. I was just existing, going through the motions of life without really living. You and our children, you are the best things that ever happened to me. Every single day, I wake up grateful that you knocked on my door." Ophelia leaned her head on his shoulder. "I am grateful too. For you, for our family, for this life we have built together." They sat in comfortable silence, and Zane thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The war that had left him adrift, the years of solitude, the stormy night when a desperate widow had appeared at his door. All of it had led to this, to a life full of love and purpose and meaning. "I love you," he said, "not for the first time and not for the last." "I love you too," Ophelia replied. From inside the cabin they heard one of the twins cry out, probably from a bad dream. Ophelia started to rise, but Zane gently pushed her back down. "I will go," he said. He found Otto sitting up in bed, tears on his cheeks. Oscar was still asleep in the bed next to him, thumb in his mouth. Zane sat down and pulled Otto onto his lap. "What is wrong, son?" "I had a scary dream," Otto said, his voice small. "There was a big storm and I could not find you or Mama. That does sound scary, but it was just a dream. Your Mama and I are right here and we are not going anywhere. Promise." "I promise." Zane smoothed Otto's hair back from his forehead. "Do you want to know a secret?" Otto nodded, his tears already drying. "When I was a young man, before I met your Mama, I used to have bad dreams too. Dreams about being alone, about not having anyone who cared about me. But then one night during a big storm, your Mama knocked on my door. And after that, the bad dreams went away because I was not alone anymore. Because you had Mama." "That is right." "And then we had you and your brothers and sister. And now I have so many people who care about me that I could never be alone, even if I wanted to be. And the same is true for you. You have me and Mama and Owen and Olive and Oscar. We are a family, and families stick together." Otto seemed satisfied with this explanation. He snuggled into Zane's chest, his small body warm and trusting. Zane held him for a few more minutes, then tucked him back into bed. By the time he got back outside, Ophelia had gone inside to check on the baby. Wait, there was no baby. Zane shook his head, amused at his own confusion. The twins were the youngest at 5 years old. But in his mind, at least one of the children was always the baby, no matter how old they got. The next few years were good ones. The ranch prospered, and Zane was able to buy more land and more cattle. Owen turned 15 and started talking about wanting to go to school in the city, maybe become a lawyer. Zane was proud of his son's ambition, even though the thought of him leaving made his chest ache. Olive was 12, and had discovered a talent for drawing, filling page after page of a journal with sketches of the landscape and animals around the ranch. The twins were 10 and still inseparable, though their personalities were starting to diverge. Oscar was the more cautious one, while Otto would try anything once. Ophelia turned 40 that year, and Zane threw her a party, inviting the Williams and several other families they had become friends with over the years. She protested that she was too old for such fuss, but Zane could tell she was pleased. That night, after everyone had gone home and the children were in bed, they lay together in the darkness. 40 years old, Ophelia mused. Half my life is probably over. Do not talk like that, Zane said. I am not being morbid, just realistic. But I have been thinking about what I have done with those 40 years, and I realized something. The first half of my life was all about surviving. Losing my parents, marrying Thomas, trying to make a go of the ranch, then losing him and being left with nothing. It felt like I was always just barely keeping my head above water. She turned to face him in the darkness. But this second half, the half I have spent with you, has been about living. Really living. Building something meaningful, raising our children, loving you. I would not change a single moment of it. Neither would I, Zane said. He was 47 now, and he could feel his age in his joints when he woke in the morning, in the way his back ached after a long day of work. But he had never felt more alive than he did with Ophelia by his side. The children continued to grow. Owen did go away to school when he was 17, studying law in Helena. He wrote letters home regularly, and Zane and Ophelia read them aloud to the whole family at dinner. Olive began selling her drawings, contributing to the family income in her own way. The twins started taking on more responsibility around the ranch, and Zane could see that at least one of them, probably Oscar, would want to stay and take over the ranch someday. When Owen came home for a visit during his second year of school, he brought a surprise with him. A young woman named Sarah, who he introduced as his intended. She was smart and kind, and Zane and Ophelia both liked her immediately. They were married the following summer in a ceremony in Fort Stockton, and Owen promised he would bring her to visit regularly. Olive met a young man from a neighboring ranch when she was 19, a quiet fellow named David who appreciated her art and did not mind that she spent hours lost in her sketches. They married 2 years later and built a small cabin on the edge of Zane and Ophelia's property, close enough to visit regularly but far enough for privacy. The twins, as predicted, stayed on the ranch. Oscar married a woman from Fort Stockton named Ruth, while Otto seemed content to remain a bachelor, at least for the time being. They built their own cabin on the property, and the ranch became a true family enterprise, with 3 generations living and working together. Zane turned 60, and his hair had gone completely gray. Ophelia was 53, and her hair was threaded with silver, but to Zane she was as beautiful as she had been that first night when she had stood dripping on his floor. They had grandchildren now, 6 of them ranging in age from infant to 10 years old, and the cabin was often full of their laughter and noise. One evening, Zane and Ophelia took a walk together, just the 2 of them. It was something they tried to do regularly, carving out time alone amidst the chaos of their large family. They walked to the spot where Zane had first told Ophelia he loved her, where they had sat under the stars and planned their future. You remember that night? Ophelia asked, as if reading his mind. I remember every moment I have spent with you, Zane said. But yes, I remember that night especially. I was terrified you would say no, that you would tell me you could never love anyone but Thomas. I was terrified too. Terrified that I was betraying Thomas by falling in love again. Terrified that you did not really mean it. Terrified that I would lose you the way I had lost everyone else I loved. She squeezed his hand. But I am so glad I took that chance. These past 30 years with you have been the happiest of my life." 30 years, Zane repeated, marveling at it. It seems like yesterday and a lifetime ago all at once. They stood there watching the sun set, and Zane pulled Ophelia into his arms. They had weathered so much together. Harsh winters and dry summers, sick children and financial worries, the everyday challenges of building a life together. But through it all, they had had each other, and that had made all the difference. "Thank you," Zane said. "For what?" "For knocking on my door during that storm. For saying yes when I asked you to stay. For loving me. For giving me a family and a purpose and a reason to keep going." His voice was rough with emotion. "For everything." Ophelia reached up and touched his face, her fingers gentle against his weathered skin. "You saved me, Zane. I was lost and alone and hopeless, and you gave me a home. You gave me love. You gave me a life worth living. I should be thanking you." "We saved each other," Zane said, and kissed her. Even after all these years, kissing her still felt like the most natural thing in the world. They walked back to the cabin as the stars began to appear. Through the windows, they could see their family gathered inside. Owen and Sarah were there with their 3 children, visiting for the week. Olive and David had come for dinner and stayed to play cards. The twins and Oscar's wife Ruth were cleaning up from the meal, while the grandchildren ran around playing some elaborate game. Zane and Ophelia stood outside for a moment, just watching. This was their legacy, Zane thought. Not the ranch or the land or the cattle, but this family they had created together. These people who existed because 31 years ago, a desperate widow had knocked on a lonely cowboy's door during a storm, and he had let her in without a word. "Ready to go inside?" Ophelia asked. "Always," Zane said, and together they walked through the door into the warmth and light and love that awaited them. Years continued to pass, marked by the changing seasons and the milestones of their growing family. More grandchildren came, and then great-grandchildren. Zane and Ophelia grew older, their movements slower, their faces more lined. But their love for each other never dimmed. If anything, it grew stronger with each passing year, deepened by shared memories and the life they had built together. Zane was 72 when his health began to fail. The doctor said it was his heart, worn out from years of hard work and hard living. Ophelia refused to accept it at first, insisting that Zane was too stubborn to die. But as the months passed and Zane grew weaker, she had to face the reality that their time together was coming to an end. One warm summer evening, Zane asked Ophelia to help him outside. He wanted to sit and watch the sunset one more time. Their children and grandchildren were all there, gathered to say goodbye to the patriarch of the family. But Zane wanted a few minutes alone with his wife first. They sat in the same spot where they had sat so many times before, where they had first confessed their love, where they had planned their future and watched their children grow. Ophelia held Zane's hand, and neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say that had not already been said 1,000 times over the years. "I love you," Zane finally said, his voice weak but clear. "I have loved you from the moment you knocked on my door, and I will love you until I take my last breath and beyond." "I know," Ophelia said, tears streaming down her face. "And I love you just as much. You gave me everything, Zane, everything." "You gave me more," Zane said. "You gave me a reason to live." He died 3 days later, surrounded by his family. Ophelia held his hand until the very end, and when he took his last breath, she leaned down and kissed his forehead one final time. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for letting me in." Ophelia lived for another 8 years after Zane's death. She stayed on the ranch, cared for by her children and grandchildren, and she spent her days tending her garden and watching her great-grandchildren play. She never remarried, never even considered it. Zane had been the love of her life, and she was content to live out her remaining years with his memory. On a cold December night, Ophelia passed away in her sleep. She was buried next to Zane in the small family cemetery on the edge of the property. Their children, now elderly themselves, stood at the graveside and remembered the love their parents had shared. They were lucky to find each other, Owen said, now 60 years old himself and a grandfather several times over. They were, Olive agreed, but it was not just luck. Mama was brave enough to knock on that door during the storm, and Papa was kind enough to let her in. They chose to love each other every single day after that. That is what made them lucky. Years later, when the ranch was sold to a family from back east, they found a letter tucked into the frame of the bed in the master bedroom. It was in Ophelia's handwriting, dated the day before she died. To whoever finds this, the letter read, "This house was built with love and filled with joy. A lifetime ago, I knocked on a door during a storm, and a good man let me in without a word. He gave me shelter and kindness and eventually his heart. We built a life together here, raised our children, grew old together. I am leaving this world with no regrets, knowing that I was loved and that I loved in return. May you find as much happiness in this place as we did." The new family framed the letter and hung it on the wall, a reminder of the love story that had unfolded within these walls. And on stormy nights, when the wind howled and the rain pounded on the roof, they would think of the widow who had knocked on a cowboy's door all those years ago, and the life that had blossomed from that single act of kindness. The end.